2 For the love of Lacan, Jacques Derrida I. The future anterior in the conditional. What wouldn't Lacan have said? What will he not have said? This is an exclamation rather than a question. I am trying out my voice, looking for the right tone, as in an experiment prior to beginning this idiomatic conjunction of negation, disavowal, the conditional, and the future anterior. My hypothesis, these grammars play either successively or simultaneously a role of screen and mirror in the modalities of the with, avec, as well as in the modalities of the since, depuis, which will have determined Lacan's relation to the philosophers to certain philosophers. These brief observations on temporal modalities will all be marked by the incidence of Stephen Melville's observations, see head not, PR2R, on narration thus on history, on the temporal shifts and also on the possibility of a turning point in Lacan following the Ecrits, that is, more precisely, since 1966 to 67. What will Lacan not have said? What wouldn't he have said? What was it with Lacan with the philosophers? To approach this question, it would be necessary to shed light not only on what with can mean in this case, but on what Lacan said, did not say, will have or will not have said, caused to be said, or let be said in the future anterior or in the conditional. To deal with this enigma of the future anterior and the conditional, which is what I will be particularly interested in today, is to deal with the problem of archivization, of what remains or does not remain. It is an old, familiar problem. During this century, however, the birth of psychoanalysis, in conjunction with the advent of new techniques of archivization or telecommunication, has consolidated the apparatus of certain paradoxes with which, in my view at least, conventional history, the way in which history or histories are written or told, has not yet systematically come to terms. Quite simply, the concept of history is no doubt at stake. The effects of these paradoxes, which could be termed techno-psychoanalytical, since they concern, conjointly and by the same token, what psychoanalysis can tell us about inscription, erasure, blanks, the non-said, memory storage, and new techniques of archivization. This one, for example, look at all the tape recorders that are in this room, do not exclusively concern Lacan, of course. But the example of Lacan offers certain singular aspects that merit the attention of anyone interested in these questions. One problem with colloquia, a problem I at least find hard to bear, is that no one goes into details. Instead of treating things themselves, with as keen an eye as possible, we must, for lack of time and because our voice is swept along by swelling, chorus-like rhythms, make do without the minutiae of the letter, that is, those microscopic or micrological displacements where I incorrigibly persist in hoping things get decided at a given moment. But the given moment is never given. That this given moment be given is just what is never given in advance, and here we have arrived, too soon, of course, well in advance, at the question of destination. Owing to this macroscopia or macrologic of the colloquium, movements of external strategy, if one can put it that way, and if there were a purely external strategy, which I do not believe tend in the main to prevail. What thus tends to prevail are theses, positions, position takings, positionings. I've never much liked these things, and I've rarely stopped to consider theses, which is not only a question of taste. It is nothing less than the question of philosophy, of what is accorded there to the thesis, to positionality. In a reading of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which is not just any book by Freud and, as you know, not just any book by Freud for Lacan, I attempted, to speculate on Freud, to indicate in what way Freud advanced only by suspending, without any possibility of stopping, all the theses at which his successors or as, his readers in general, would have liked to see him stop. That reading was also an interpretation of what links speculation on the name, the proper name, or family names to science, particularly to the theory and the institution of psychoanalysis. It goes without saying that my reading also concerned, explicitly, provided that a certain code or program of translation was available, the question of Lacan's name, the problems of legacy, of science and institution, and the aparias of archivization in which that name is involved. I will thus attempt to resist once more the impulse toward or expectation of position taking. To those who are waiting for me to take a position so they can reach a decision, a writ judgment, I say, good luck. So as not to become lost in the quantity and difficulty of the problems that would have to be addressed, so as not to keep you here too long, so as not to reopen all the texts, which are, after all, available to and in principle legible by whoever wants to look at them, I will take as my rule discussion, since this is the time for discussion, above all the discussion as it has been initiated by René Major and Stephen Melville in what they have just said. But it goes without saying that, following my remarks, it will be up to you to propose, if you wish, another space for this discussion. René Major cited the incipit of Lacan's seminar of the 16th of November, 1976, which begins, were you able to read the poster? Avez-vous su lire l'affiche, and which speaks of the insuccess, the non-success, l'insuccès cite the unknown known. I translate this in my own manner, which is perhaps already no longer very Lacanian, as l'insuc tilde est qui equa arrive, the non-success that fails to arrive, which is to say, the failure that fails because it arrives, because it succeeds, that fails to succeed. The syntax of to displaces itself here surreptitiously, but very necessarily, and I have often played on this, in order to pass from one grammar to another. I fail to arrive means at the same time I do not arrive at arriving, and I fail or I do not arrive because I arrive. I do not arrive at arriving, once, because, since I arrive here it is the event that speaks, it is of the event, the arrival, the coming, and the come that I am speaking. Speaking, then, of the insuccess as what does not succeed in arriving, precisely by arriving, by the fact of arriving, because it arrives. Major cites Lacan's seminar dated the 16th of November, 1976. The single stroke, le trait en est, interests us because, as Freud points out, it does not necessarily have to do with a loved one. One Major is quite right to add, I hasten to add that it is not always those who love you who render you the greatest service. I would be dead if I didn't believe he was right on this point. I would be dead and, if I have understood correctly, this would not be without some secondary benefit, at least for my name, but I preferred to let things wait. And if I were to say now, you see, I think that we loved each other very much, Lacan and I am almost certain that many of you here would not stand for it. Many would not stand for it, which explains a lot of things. Many would not stand for it, and not because it surprised them, not at all. I even wonder if this idea is not strangely familiar to them. Not because of surprise, then, but because it is a thing that ought not to have happened, and above all that cannot be said without presumptuousness, especially by a sole speaker who says we all alone after the death of the other. Thus the thing should not be said and especially not repeated, and yet, if I repeated we loved each other very much, Lacan and I, each as he will have pleased, each in his way or each in our way, would that constitute a revelation, a confession, or a denunciation? Let everyone take this as it may please him. This as it may please him is a quotation from Lacan, from a quasi-private phrase between Lacan and myself, in which him is me. I will return to this shortly. As for being shocked to hear someone say we when speaking all alone after the death of the other, there is no reason for it. This is one of the most common phenomena of what I have called destinerance. It inflicts an internal drift on the destination of the letter, from which it may never return, but to which we will have to return. We is a modality of the with, of the being with or the doing with, avec, apart hoc, at the home of, chez, the other, as guest or parasite. We is always said by a sole person. It is always a sole person who has the goal to say we psychoanalysts, we philosophers with you psychoanalysts, with us philosophers, or, still more seriously, we psychoanalysts with the philosophers or with us philosophers. Avec, with, also means chez, at the home of, apart, of you, avec, apart hoc, category of the guest or the intruder, of the host or the parasite, therefore, who always takes advantage as soon as he says we. This logico-grammatical modality seems interesting because, among other things, it is always me who says we, it is always an I who utters we, supposing thereby, in effect, in the asymmetrical structure of the utterance, the other to be absent, dead, in any case incompetent, or even arriving too late to object. The one signs for the other. The asymmetry is even more violent if we are talking about a reflexive, reciprocal, or specular we. Who will ever have the right to say, we love each other? But is there any other origin of love, any other amorous performative than this presumptuousness? If there is some we in being with, it is because there is always one who speaks all alone in the name of the other, from the other, there is always one of them who lives more, lives longer. I will not hasten to call this one the subject. When we are with someone, we know without delay that one of us will survive the other. So he already does and will be able or will have to speak on his own. And one can immediately draw the consequences from this. This happens every day. Even when we are singing the Marseillaise or joining in a chorus, what remains the exception and does not commit us very much is a self that can say we, for example, we love each other. What is getting archived? That is not a question. It is once again an exclamation, with a somewhat suspended exclamation point because it is always difficult to know if it is getting archived, what is getting archived, how it is getting archived, the trace that arrives only to efface itself only by effacing itself, beyond the alternative of presence and absence. It is not merely difficult to know this, it is strictly impossible, no doubt not because there is always more to be known but because it is not of the order of knowledge. This is never a sufficient reason not to seek to know, as an ought clearer to know that it is getting archived, within what limits, and how, according to what date surprising, or overdetermined paths. Earlier, René Major alluded first to an underground history in the trajectory of Lacan's discourse and then to a question in question that, I quote, has a history, concerns texts, several texts, which are neither limited to an identifiable circle nor delimited by a geographic area, and this despite the fact that even if and especially if it does not take the advertised form of an academic and institutional program. The question of the question is more vast and stems from procedures of translation and theoretical practical issues that join up at the borders of several disciplines, that they destabilize to yes, I believe that this is true in general and more particularly for what is in question under the title Lacan with the philosophers. The modalities of the with here call for a history and a type of historical interpretation that would have to be extremely careful and slow, bringing to bear great micrological refinement. They call for constant attention to the paradoxes of archivization, to what psychoanalysis, which would not be just the theme or the object of this history but its interpretation, can tell us about these paradoxes of archivization, about its blanks, the efficacy of its details or its known appearance, its capitalizing reserve or but here we perhaps step beyond psychoanalysis about the radical destruction of the archive, in ashes, without the repression and the putting in reserve or on guard that would operate in repression through a mere topical displacement. An equally keen attention is required with regard to what may be problematic in psychoanalytic discourse, for example, Lacan's as concerns, precisely, archivization, the guard or reserve, the economy of repression as guard, inscription, effacement, the destructibility of the letter or the name. A history that could measure up to these formidable difficulties, could be capable of taking them into account in its own historical discourse, ought to come as an addition to other readings of the archive whether conventional or not, and more classically symptomatic without in the least disqualifying them, since they are just as indispensable or at least inevitable. This is not about to happen soon. Before proposing, in response to what has just been said, a modest, partial, and preliminary contribution to such a history, I will explain in a few words why and in what spirit I accepted the invitation so graciously extended by my friends at the College International de Philosophy, René Major and Patrick Guillemard who, I believe, first had the fine idea of this plural and international colloquium. If Phil said yes, it is certainly not because I think I had something more or irreplaceable to say on these matters. The discussion of what I ventured almost 20 years ago around these questions would demand a microscopic examination for which neither you nor I have the time or the patience. As I've already said, such an examination is, moreover, ill-suited to the rhythm and setting of a large colloquium. No, if I was happy to accept the invitation and if I did so almost 2 years ago, even before I knew who would be speaking here and what would be said, in particular what Major would say, or even what would be the tide of his talk, since it never occurred to me to ask him, it is because this colloquium, besides the considerable and necessary work that can go on here on subjects that have been too often avoided up to now, especially within the analytic milieu, including the milieu around Lacan, also constitutes an international homage to Lacan. And it is with this event, this justly deserved and spectacular homage to Lacan, that I was happy to be asked to associate myself. Not only but also because, in our time and I mean the time of culture and especially Parisian culture, find a political significance in this homage. I consider it an act of cultural resistance to pay homage publicly to a difficult form of thought, discourse, or writing, one which does not submit easily to normalization by the media, by academics, or by publishers, one which rebels against the restoration currently underway, against the philosophical or for the love of Lacan-retical neo-conformism in general. Let us not even mention literature, that flattens and levels everything around us, in the attempt to make one forget what the Lacan era was, along with the future and the promise of his thought, thereby raising the name of Lacan. As you know, there are countless ways to do this, sometimes very paradoxical ways. In his lifetime, Lacan underwent the experience dubbed excommunication. Some of those who claim to draw on Lacan's name, and not just his legacy, can be not the least active or the least effective in this operation. Here, once again, the logic of the service rendered is highly tricky, and censorship, suturing, and defense of orthodoxy do not in the least exclude quite the contrary fake it of cultural eclecticism. Whether one is talking about philosophy, psychoanalysis, or theory in general, what the flat-footed restoration underway attempts to recover, disavow, or censor is the fact that nothing of that which managed to transform the space of thought in the last decades would have been possible without some coming to terms with Lacan, without the Lacanian provocation, however one receives it or discusses it and, I will add, without some coming to terms with Lacan in his coming to terms with the philosophers. With the philosophers rather than with philosophy, I have always been seduced by the dramatization in which Lacan broke with the commentary or the historiography in use by many professional philosophers either when they give a more or less competent account of philosophers' lives or when they reconstitute the structure of systems. Instead, he staged the singular desire of the philosopher and thereby contributed considerably to opening the space for a sort of new philosophical culture, in which we are situated, despite efforts to make us forget it so as to turn back the clock. In Lacan, the being with or the coming to terms with the philosophers attained a refinement, a scope, an unexpected illumination of the searchlight effect, coup d'effet, of which there are few other examples either in the community of professional philosophers or in that of psychoanalysts. Therefore rarely to this degree will a frequenting of philosophers, a being with philosophers, have, and I say this in the sense of the greatest favor or fervor for the love of Lacan 47 merited discussion, merited that one discuss with Lacan the manner in which he will have managed his relations with the philosophers. Lacan's refinement and competence, his philosophical originality, have no precedent in the tradition of psychoanalysis. The return to a Freud philosopher would have been from this point of view a regression or a weakness. Later on I will say a brief word about the paradoxical and perverse consequences that flow from the fact that Lacan is so much more aware as a philosopher than Freud, so much more a philosopher than Freud. Having thus accepted with pleasure the invitation to participate in this reflection, this discussion, and this homage, I did not think I ought to take offense or become discouraged, as others might legitimately have done, and as some perhaps wished I would do, when they put forward the pretext of a rule according to which only the dead could be spoken about here, and therefore, if one insisted on speaking of me, one could do so only under the condition that I played dead, even before the fact, and that I be given a helping hand when the occasion arose. 3. That is, it was enough just to think of it, to make me disappear nominally as a live person because I am alive, to make me disappear for life. So I thought I should not let myself get offended or discouraged, bon vivant that I still am, by the lamentable and indecent incident of the borrowing of my proper name from the program billing, afchichich, of the veto exercised against those remains of a proper name that may be an adjective or attribute. I am referring to the acting out to which Major alluded a moment ago and whose essentials he in fact summarized. Although I was indeed shocked, as were many, by the symptomatic and compulsive violence of that acting out, I was not surprised by what it symptomized, for I have had a lot of practice analyzing this symptom for almost a quarter of a century. Therefore, to save time, I will not add anything more for the moment because I find all this increasingly tedious and because, let's say, I know only too well. There is, finally, another reason, even if one sets aside the sinister political memory we have of the history that, in France and especially in Eastern France, has been written, so to speak, not in ink but in the effacement of the name, even, then, if one sets aside this political memory, the most important of what there is to say on this subject has been said, by none other than Freud and by Lacan who knew what he was talking about. And, if I may be allowed this self-reference, elsewhere, in several books, including one on the names of Freud and Lacan, I have already sufficiently formalized readability under erasure and the logic of the event as graphematic event, notably as event of the proper name, in which the little devil arrives only to erase itself by raising itself to be spared having to add anything here for the moment. It is advisable out of modesty at least to follow such a course, since in this case it seems to be a matter of my so-called proper name or of what may remain of it in an epithet. That said, if any among you wish me to do so, I will not insist on silencing what I think of all this, but only at the end, after we're done, as a postscriptum, in parentheses, or off the record as one says in English. Off the record means not recorded, outside the archive. We are thus brought back to the difficult question of the record, history, and the archive. Is there an outside the archive? Impossible, but the impossible is deconstruction's affair. At bottom, beneath the question that I will call once again the remaining restance of the archive which does anything but remain in the sense of the permanent subsistence of a presence, beneath this question of the difference or the destinance of the archive, there could take shape, at least for the time of a session, the silhouette of everything that, in my view, deserves to be discussed, since we are here to discuss or to continue discussions. By this I mean the silhouette of what seemed to me to deserve discussion, not with Lacan in general and certainly not in the name of philosophy in general, on the subject, in the name, or from the point of view of which I have never spoken, no more than of anti-philosophy, as a consequence, which has always seemed to me the thing least deserving of interest in the world. Thus, not with Lacan in general who for me does not exist, and I never speak of a philosopher or a corpus in general as if it were a matter of a homogeneous body, I did not do so for Lacan any more than for any other. The Dis for the Love of Lacan 49 cushion was begun rather with a forceful, relatively coherent, and stabilized configuration of a discourse at the time of the collection and binding of Écrits, in other words, in 1966. The binding of Écrits is what holds it together and provides it with the most solid, systematic structure, the most formalized constructure, as formalized as possible. Now if there is one text that stands more than any other in this position and at this post of binder, it is the Seminar on the Purloined Letter. As you know, the Seminar on the Purloined Letter is given a privilege which is Lacan's word, I quote Lacan, the privilege of opening the sequence of Écrits, despite its diachrony, for in other words, Écrits collects and binds together all the texts out of which it is composed in the chronological order, according to the diachrony, of their prior publication, with the exception of the Seminar on the Purloined Letter which, by coming at the beginning, is thereby given the privilege of figuring the synchronic configuration of the set and thus binding the whole together. It therefore seemed to me legitimate to take a privileged interest in this privilege. If I'll use the word binding here, the binding that holds together at the moment of reading and rereading, it is because on one of the two sole occasions in my life on which I met Lacan and spoke briefly with him, he himself spoke to me of binding and of the binding of Écrits. I am not telling these stories for the sake of the amusement or distraction of anecdotes, but because what we are supposed to be talking about here is the encounter, contingency or not, and what binds, if you will, the signature of the event to the theorem. I only met Lacan twice, though I crossed paths with him a third time, long after, at a cocktail party. I don't know if that means we were together, one with the other, but in any case these two encounters did not take place at the home of, apart, one or the other but at a third party's, first abroad, in 1966 in the United States, to which both of us had been for the first time exported. I say exported on purpose. In fact it is a quotation. Perhaps you know that behind the pseudonyms deemed to be transparent by the newspapers, the recognizable character from a very bad novel, when I say bad, I mean in the literary sense and not only the moral sense, who complains about not being translated abroad, complaining with a bitterness that seems to permeate the very paper on which it is written, said quite recently, in a single breath, that Lacan and I, Lacan with me, alias Lawson with cider for those in the know, were both of us adulterated products fit for exportation. To find myself in the same export container with Lacan would have been rather to my taste, but this was not bearable for everyone or to everyone's taste, since a journalist who shuttles back and forth between the editorial board of Gallimard and La Nouvelle Observateur opted to separate me from avec Lacan by saying that, for the author of this disconcerting novel, it was only Derrida using my name, not that of the fictional character, not even Saidi, Cedar, or Cider who, this time in the singular, through an adulterated quotation, becomes an adulterated product fit for exportation. I alone, no longer with Lacan, as the author or the character of the fable wanted it, but without Lacan, me all alone now, adulterated product in the export container, me all alone in my box, deported, exported abroad, and, why not, forbidden to frequent certain places, forbidden a residence permit, me all alone, isolated, insulated by the decree of a cultural traffic cop. This is one of the things that is happening in France today, in the higher spheres of culture and politics that I spoke of at the outset. 5. So, to start over, when I met Lacan in Baltimore for the first time, in 1966 we were introduced to each other by René Girard's first words, uttered in a friendly sigh, were, so we had to wait to come here, and abroad, in order to meet each other. Here, I remark, perhaps because of the problem of destinarance that is waiting for us and perhaps because of Baltimore's mortal name, Baltimore, dance or trance and terror, Baltimore the city of Poe, whose grave I looked for in vain during those days, although I was able to visit his house on that occasion, I went Chapeau in 1966, perhaps then because of this mortal name of Baltimore, I remark that the only 2 times we met and spoke briefly one with the other, it was a question of death between us, and first of all from Lacan's mouth. In Baltimore, for example, he spoke to me of the way in which he thought he would be read, in particular by me, after his death. At our second and last encounter, during a dinner offered by his in-laws, he insisted on publicly archiving in his own way, with regard to something I had told him, the disregard of the other that I had supposedly attempted by playing dead. Elizabeth Raldinesco recounts very well this whole episode, which I reread this morning on page 418 of her monumental and classic History of Psychoanalysis in France, Volume 2. Lacan's phrase speaks of a father and that's me, a father who does not recognize, the way he himself disregarded the other, Big Zero. By playing dead 6 I am still not sure I have fully understood the ventured interpretation in what was, we should not forget, a signed publication inside a seat, where Lacan alone was authorized, by himself, to sign, but I have always wondered whether by making me out to be the father in this story, by naming me the father he was not taking aim at the son. I have always wondered whether he didn't mean to say the son, if he didn't want to play the son, to make me or himself into the son, to make of me the son who disregards the other by playing dead, as he put it, or make himself into the son. As always, Lacan left me the greatest freedom of interpretation, and as always I would have taken it even if he had not left it to me, as it will have pleased me. He left me the greatest freedom to hear and to interpret because he added right after this, to the father who said it to me, from here to hear me or not, or perichimi, adit dicim entendre ou non, dot. This didicai is magnificent, I hear it in Latin, as if in the dark of a disco this time, and not a ballroom, of a disco where the old professor cannot manage to give up, narive pars renanza, the combined compulsion of the future anterior and didactics, didicai, I will have told you, I will have taught you. Lacan left me this freedom to interpret as I please on the flyleaf of Ecritz when it was bound, because the dedication that accompanies it says, to Jacques Derrida, this homage to take as it may please him. Message received, I have always, and again today, used this homage as it pleases me and as it pleases me to give it and to give it back, Larendra. So there was death between us, it was especially a question of death, I will say even only of the death of one of us, as it is with all those who love each other. Or rather he spoke about it, he alone, since for my part I never breathed a word about it. He spoke, alone, about our death, about his death that would not fail to arrive, and about the death or rather the dead one that, according to him, I was playing. I am not forgetting the binding with which all of this is bound up. The other worry Lacan confided to me in Baltimore concerned the binding of Ecritz, which had not yet appeared, although its publication was imminent. Lacan was worried and slightly annoyed, it seemed to me, with those at Le Seuil, his publishers, who had advised him to assemble everything in a single large volume of more than 900 pages. There was thus a risk that the binding would not be strong enough and would give way. You'll see, he told me as he made a gesture with his hands, it's not going to hold up. The republication in the 2-volume paperback edition in 1970 will thus have reassured him and will have allowed him, in passing, not only to confirm the necessity of placing the seminar on the purloined letter at the entry post of Ecritz, but also to fire off one of those future anteriors, antedotes or antidotes, that will have been the privileged mode of all the declarations of loath that he so often made to me, by mentioning, I dare not say by antedoting, and I quote, what I call literally the instance of the letter prior to any grammatology. 7. Prior to any grammatology, of grammatology was first the title of an article published some 5 years before Lacan's new introduction, and this is one of the numerous mistakes or misrecognitions made by Lacan and so many others. It never proposed a grammatology, some positive science or discipline bearing that name. 8. On the contrary, both the article and later the book of the same title went to great lengths to demonstrate the impossibility, the conditions of impossibility, the absurdity, in principle, of any science or any philosophy bearing the name grammatology. The book that treated of grammatology was anything but a grammatology. I link this and bind it once again to the binding of the great book. I go back then to the period, the end of the 1960s, 1965, 1966 to 67, when Ecritz was being bound under the sign of the seminar on the purloined letter. I would now like to venture a modest contribution to this history to come of the being with of Lacan and the philosophers, a history which I am quite sure has never been written and which I am not sure ever can be written, even assuming it can be deciphered. What I will propose, then, are merely a few protocols for such a history, whether or not it is possible. And since I have already spoken too long, I will limit myself somewhat arbitrarily to 3 protocols. I am certain there is enough psychoanalysis and psychoanalysts here to prevent anyone from dismissing as self-indulgence or coquetry the fact that I will describe things not from an overview looking down on this history from above, but necessarily from the place where I was and am still situated, inscribed, engaged, invested. A place that, I must say, will not have been very comfortable but also not a bad one for observation. I will schematize the 3 protocols according to several figures under the following headings. Igeismus 2. The future anterior of the after the fact, la prescu, 3 times geismatic invagination of the borders or the site of analysis. What happens to the width between 2 when there is geismus, the after the fact of the future anterior, and geismatic invagination. 2. First protocol, geismus was mentioned by Major. He spoke of the geismus between the trajectories of Freud and Lacan as regards science and philosophical speculation. I would like to give the example of another geismus that occurs in France during the 1960s. When the seminar on the purloined letter proposes the broadest strategic formalization of the Lacanian discourse at the opening of Ecritz, what is happening with the philosophers? Here we can no longer speak assuming that we ever could of philosophers in general, but of what happens to some of them, or of what happens to philosophy through some of them who are perhaps no longer simply philosophers, without having anything against philosophy, which would be rather simplistic and scholastic. It so happened and it happened to me that at the moment when a certain number of major or dominant philosophers, organized into what I proposed at the time naming phonocentrism and / or phallogocentrism, called for, so to speak, to go quickly, a deconstructive questioning, a questioning that was obviously, by definition, both philosophical and eccentric, centering in relation to the philosophical as such, giving one to think the philosophical from a place that could no longer be simply philosophical or counter-philosophical, within or outside philosophy. At the same moment, exactly the same moment, it was possible to witness a theoretical binding of the Lacanian discourse that made the most strenuous, and powerfully spectacular, use of all the motifs that were in my view deconstructible, undergoing deconstruction. Even more serious, in my opinion, was the fact that it concerned not only the most deconstructible motifs of philosophy, phonocentrism, logocentrism, phallogocentrism, false speech as truth, the transcendentalism of the signifier, the circular return of reappropriation toward what is most proper about the proper place, whose borders are circumscribed by lack, and so forth, through a handling of philosophical reference whose form, at least, was in the best of cases elliptical and aphoristic, in the worst, dogmatic. I will come back to this in a moment, but even that which, crossing through and overflowing philosophy or onto theology, I mean the Heideggerian discourse, seemed to me already, and this goes back to 1965, to call in its turn for deconstructive questions. Lacan at that time, as has frequently been mentioned here, referred habitually, in a frequent, decisive, self-confident, and sometimes incantatory way, to Heideggerian speech, to the logos interpreted by Heidegger, to the truth, which, moreover, was just as often taken in the sense of adequation as it was in the sense of veiling/unveiling. There is no point in recalling here once again that deconstruction, if there is any, is not a critique, still less a theoretical or speculative operation methodically carried out by someone. Rather, if there is any deconstruction, it takes place, which I have said too often, and yet once again in psyche, to dare to repeat it again, as experience of the impossible. I attempted to show this in Le Facte de la Vérité and elsewhere. I would be unable to reconstitute all this here in so little time. So here is the form of the chiasmus. I found myself at the time faced with a powerful philosophizing reconstitution of psychoanalysis that articulated, assumed, and linked up, with the greatest consistency and consequence, all the motifs that elsewhere were offering themselves, although not without resistance, to something like a genealogico-deconstructed interpretation. At the same time, of course, it was not a matter of regretting, still less of opposing this philosophical restructuration of the psychoanalytic discourse or institutions, this philosophical and thus critical questioning. In also putting to work what is most vital in philosophy, linguistics, anthropology, in displacing and reformalizing them in turn in an original fashion, it was so much more interesting than what was then going about in a dogmatic slumber under the name of psychoanalysis. This chiasmus, or, as Major put it, this crisscross was all the more paradoxical in that there was an impulse coming from psychoanalysis in general ever since Freud, whom I was trying as well to read in my own, not very Lacanian way, in Freud and the scene of writing to deconstruct the privilege of presence, at least as consciousness and ecological consciousness. In an apparently external but doubtless not fortuitous fashion, this impulse was converging with the necessity of deconstructing this privilege according to other paths, other questions, those with which I was involved elsewhere, readings of Husserl, Heidegger, the question of writing and literature, and so forth. With the result that the discourse that was at the same time the closest and the most deconstructible, the one that was most to be deconstructed, was no doubt Lacan's. This was already signalled in Of Grammatology in 1965-66 with regard to the primacy of the signifier. That is why, as I said in Positions in 1971, 4 years before publishing Le Facte de la Vérité, Major mentioned this a moment ago, my theoretical coming to terms with Lacan consisted in pursuing my own work according to its specific pathways and requirements, whether or not this work should encounter Lacan's, and Lacan's I do not at all reject the idea more than any other today. 9 Was this not a way of saying that I loved and admired him a lot? And of paying homage to him, in a way that pleased me? It is in this same text that I said, with and without philosophy, with and without Lacan, truth is necessary, il faut la vérité. So, since then, have we exited from this chiasmus? I do not believe we have. Given this chiasmus, which made Lacan's discourse too philosophical for me, too much at home with the philosophers despite, of course, all sorts of disavowals on this subject, too much at home with all those with whom I was in the process, not of breaking, which makes no sense, as I've said countless times, but of reconsidering all the contracts, a Lacanian discourse, then, too much at home with the Sartrean coexistentialism, which has not been sufficiently discussed or whose remainders have not been sufficiently pointed out in Lacan's discourse right up to Eckhardt's, where the discourse of alienation, authenticity, and so forth prevails, too much at home with Hegel, Kojève the master, and Hegel/Kojève is also Heidegger, for Kojève does not anthropologize only the phenomenology of spirit, he also Heideggerianizes it, as you know, which was very interesting, and there would be much to say about this, but I'm obliged to step up the pace here. Elizabeth Raldinesco gave us much to think about the other evening regarding this sequence. Given this chiasmus, which made of Lacan's discourse one that was too much at home with the philosophers and with Heidegger, and from 1965 on, my own reading of Heidegger was anything but at home there, and explicitly raised questions that I have continued to elaborate constantly since. I myself could not be with Lacan the way a philosopher would be with a psychoanalyst. If I have lived with Lacan, if I have come to terms with him at my own rhythm, if I have discussed with him, this being with has certainly not been that of a philosopher with a psychoanalyst. Anyway, if that had been the case, my place in this odd couple's menage will certainly not have been that of the philosopher, and still less that of someone from the university or the academy, for which it seemed to me that Lacan always harbored, to my astonishment, an intense or even avid desire. His only excuse, as regards the university, is that he was not part of it. No doubt Lacan would have liked me to play this role of academic philosopher. But to take someone, me, for example, to be an academic philosopher on the pretext that he gets paid for that by an institution, to identify him with or reduce him to that function on this pretext is above all not to read. This impulsive gesture, which is as self-interested as it is defensive, is more or less symmetrical, not altogether but more or less with the gesture that would consist in taking an analyst for an analyst on the pretext that that is what he or she gets paid for. I have always avoided that gesture. To say a little more about this chiasmus, all of whose textual and theoretical effects I cannot reconstitute, for that one would need years of minutely detailed and unflinching reading, I will take just one example. From the seminar on the purloined letter, thus from Eckhardt's, we'll take, for example, what tightly adjoins and binds a certain number of motifs, which we'll limit arbitrarily to 8 in order to suggest the standing institution of the infinite. I the motif of the proper and circular trajectory, of the reappropriating trajectory of the letter that returns to the circumscribable place of lack from which it had become detached, that letter about which Lacan says that since it can be diverted, it must have a course which is its own, qui lui est propre, 10 and a straight path, 11 obviously a circular straight path. To the motif of truth as adequation or redequation, in the circular return and the proper trajectory, of the origin to the end, of the place of detachment of the signifier to its place of reattachment or as unveiling in, I quote, that passion to unveil which has an object. Truth 12 The analyst remaining above all the master of truth 13 True speech, I vrai parole, authentic and authenticated by the other in sworn faith, being no longer speaking truly, fa parole vrai, 14 And this. Unveiling being the relay of adequation, speech appears thus all the more truly speech when its truth is less grounded in what is called adequation to the thing. 15 3 times the motif of present speech full speech, I might as well be categorical. In psychoanalytic anamnesis, it is not a question of reality, but of truth, because the effect of full speech is to reorder past contingencies by conferring on them the sense of necessities to come, thus, full speech and future anterior, such as They are constituted by the little freedom through which the subject makes them present. 16. Analysis can have for its goal only the advent of a true speech, fa parole vrai, and the realization by the subject of his history in relation to a future. 17. 4 times the disqualification, whose spirit is also very Heideggerian in its relation to techniques, of the recording and of the mechanical archive as alienating, but precisely because it comes to him through an alienated form, even a retransmission of his own recorded discourse, albeit from the mouth of his own doctor, cannot have the same effects as psychoanalytic interlocution, which therefore must be direct, live, immediate, and so forth. Thus full speech that is defined through its identity with that of which it speaks. 19. This point is very important for me. Perhaps I'll return to it because it links phonologocentrism or phallogocentrism to the analytic situation without technical interposition, without an archiving apparatus of repetition, without essential iterability, a very old philosophem, from Plato up to and including Heidegger. 5 times the transcendental position of the phallus, the privileged signifier of that mark in which the role of the logos is joined to the advent of desire. 20. A transcendental position that is nothing other than the doctrine that links truth to castration and, I quote, to the mother's lack of the penis in which the nature of the phallus is revealed. 21.6. Phonocentrism, which was at the time militant, a writing, like the dream itself, may be figurative, but like language it is always articulated symbolically, or even phonematically just like language, and in fact phonetically, from the moment it is readable. 22. As I pointed out in Le Facte de la Vérité, this fact has the value of fact only within the ethno-cultural limits of so-called phonetic systems of writing, which moreover are never phonetic through and through, otherwise there would not even be a symbolic order. This explicit and massive phonocentrism will be contradicted by Lacan himself, as if it were nothing, as if it had always been so. Future anterior of the after the fact, in 1972-73, not before but after any grammatology, as I will show in a moment. 7 times the misrecognition or the failure to take account of the literary structure of narration, the omission of the frame, of the play of signatures, and notably of its paragonal effect. I cannot reproduce the demonstration I gave in 1975 of this misrecognition, but it is not by chance that the misrecognition, particularly in its treatment of the general narrator, resembles what Nicole Laurels and Philippe Lacoulabarth talked about as a hasty collapse of the choir, the characters, and the spectators in the theatre or in tragedy, producing thereby incalculable damage in the reading at the very moment it permits a certain formalizing calculation of psychoanalytic hermeneutics. 8. A spiriting away of the effects of the double imposed story, effects which, as I believe I have also shown, ought to have blurred the borders between the imaginary and the symbolic, and thus the strictness of this tripartition to which, as you know, Lacan was also obliged to return much later. These 8 motifs and no doubt other secondary ones that I don't have time to list are strongly articulated among themselves. In fact they are indissociable and indispensable to the chief affirmation, which is fundamental, moreover, for both the destiny and the possibility of psychoanalysis, the chief affirmation with which it seemed to me urgent and strategically necessary to come to terms, namely, to quote the last words of the seminar, thus is it that what the purloined letter nay, the letter in sufferance means is that a letter always arrives at its destination. 23. Now this conclusion was possible only insofar as the letter, which for Lacan is not the signifier, but the place of the signifier, is not divided. Lacan says that it does not suffer partition. Cut a letter into small pieces, he says, and it remains the letter. It is 24. Consequently, what Lacan then calls the materiality of the signifier, which he deduces from an indivisibility that is nowhere to be found, always seemed and still seems to me to correspond to an idealization of the letter, to an ideal identity of the letter, which was a problem I had been working on elsewhere along other lines for quite some time. But and I will limit myself to this one point in our context and given the time at our disposal. Could articulate this question and this objection, on which, as it could be shown, everything else depends, another logic of the event and of destination, another thinking of singularity, the dissemination of the unique beyond a logic of castration, and so forth. I could read, then, this surreptitious idealization, not to say this idealism of Lacan's, as Stephen Melville put it, only on the basis of a work that was already underway, in a deconstructive mode, with the philosophers, and notably, as concerns the constitution of idealities, of ideal objects in Husserl. Without pursuing this any further, suffice it to say that in order to read Lacan, to read him in a problematizing and non-dogmatic fashion, it is also necessary to read, for example, Husserl, and a few others, and to read them in a problematic or deconstructive way. There is here, if he may be permitted to say so, the outline of a new training, another curriculum for psychoanalyst readers of Lacan, at least if they want to read him otherwise than in an ape-like, orthodox, and defensive manner. This parallels, in sum, the advice concerning a new training that certain of us, the rare professional philosophers who read and published on Lacan in the Philosophical University, I am thinking above all of Philippe Lacoulabarth and Jean-Luc Nancy, gave to philosophers when we told them to read Lacan, which advice was then, about 20 years ago, rather rare. If I had the time, I would explain why in my opinion all the texts of the professional philosophers to whom I have just referred are not read and are not readable in France, particularly by most French Lacanians. 3 times second protocol, the future anterior of the after the fact. I have said that my reading of the seminar on the purloined letter as well as what prefigured it from 1965 to 1971 in of grammatology and positions did not claim to enclose or exhaust Lacan. I said so explicitly in these very texts, but only to treat a strong and relatively stabilized configuration of Lacanian displacement. The discourse of Lacan, which was always very sensitive to any movement on the theoretical scene and who could blame him, continued thereafter to readjust, even recast, sometimes contradict the axioms I have just mentioned. But in 1968, the accent put on writing continued to become more pronounced, to the point of inverting, very grammatologically, the utterance I cited a moment ago concerning phonematic and even always phonetic writing, since he could write in the seminar encore, but the signifier can in no way be limited to this phonematic support. 25 earlier, René Major cited certain spectacular examples. There are many more beginning at this time of this sudden substitution of the graphematic for the phonematic, which, moreover, interests me here only as a symptomatic index in the history of ideas, as we used to say, and not in itself, since what I proposed calling trace, gram, difference, and so forth is no more graphic than it is phonematic, no more spatial than temporal. But let's drop the subject, since this is not the place to take up this serious and tenacious misunderstanding. This kind of substitution of writing for speech around 1970 deserves its own history and is not limited to Lacan. Pong told me one day, with a smile, that he was rereading his texts to see whether he had not given in too much to phonocentrism and whether he could replace speech by writing here and there without too much damage. Roger Laporte drew up a list, which I found to be as illuminating as it was remorseless, of all the places where, during the same years, our friend Maurice Blancotte, when he republished his old texts in collections, had simply replaced speech by writing. I am not sure that it is a matter of a care, as Stephen Melville put it, but if one were to open the question of the care, then it would be very general. All of this merely to say that the historical narration of what remained and still remains above all for me the future of Lacanian thought as it moves beyond Eckrits is all the more difficult in that Lacan was an incomparable listener and his discursive machine was one of such sensitivity that everything could be inscribed there with finesse or discretion. This is quite all right, who doesn't try to do the same? But, what is more, it is inscribed there in the spoken words of a seminar that, by giving rise to numerous stenotyped or tape-recorded archivings, will have then fallen prey not only to all the problems of rights, which I don't want to get into here and which M. Conti will have evoked in passing the other day, but also to all the problems posed by the delays of publishing and of an editing in the American sense that was of the most active sort. Since all of these things hang by a hair, since the stakes get decided in a word, an ellipsis, a verbal modality, a conditional or a future anterior, especially when one knows Lacan's rhetoric, I say good luck to any narrator who would try to know what was said and written by whom on which date, what would Lacan have said or not have said. This is also at bottom the problem of the letter and destination that separates me perhaps most closely from Tweck, Lacan. 4 times third protocol, chiasmatic invertination of the borders. Not only were my references to Lacan, and in particular to the seminar on the purloined letter not totalizing, homogenizing, or critical, but I even conceded he was right as concerns reason, the question of reason remaining open, as well as the question of what happens when one concedes to another, that is, when one gives reason or, as we say in French, donne raison. In the postcard, I said that he was right about the reason for a characteristic, trait, that had never before been elucidated, and which shows once again the depth of Freud's intuition, namely, why he advances the view that there is only one libido, his text showing that he conceives it as masculine in nature 26 saying Lacan is right, just as the signatory of Envoys begins by saying the beloved other is right, yes, you were right, le facte de la vérité speaks, as concerns precisely. This characteristic, trait, that had never before been elucidated of a trait drawn from reason or a check, trait, drawn on reason. In the logic said to be of the kettle, a check drawn on reason will always be right, 482-83. Saying Lacan is right or doing right by Lacan, raison donnée au rendu, makes my text still more unreadable for readers in a rush to decide between the pro and the con in short, for those minds who believed I was opposing Lacan or showing him to be wrong. The question lies elsewhere, it is the question of reason and of the principle of reason. Thus, not only was I not criticizing Lacan, but I was not even writing a sort of overseeing or objectifying meta discourse on Lacan or on a text of Lacan's. My writing involved me in a scene, which scene I was showing at the same time, no doubt in small phrases that no one reads, could not be closed or framed. All of this has since been constantly put back into play in other scenes in a bind that have been deployed here and there, more often there than here, which is to say, once again, abroad. Moreover, for all these reasons, the argument of le facte de la vérité does not lend itself to being framed in the text bearing this title. It is played, set adrift in the postcard, the book with that title, which inscribes le facte de la vérité like a piece in a borderless fiction, neither public nor private, with and without a general narrator. It is inscribed first of all in Envoys of which I am not the signatory and where a little read plot involving a wandering letter, some remarks on destination as well as on the analytic institution and what then happens, or not, demonstrate, while doing it, that which is uttered there without lending itself to some meta-utterance. I will take only one example, if I may be permitted to quote a character from this book without quoting myself. That is my excuse. From Envoys dated the 18th of August, 1979. I 8 August I 979 times. Is it true that you call me only when I'm not there? One day you told me that I was a torch come which is not valid without the tone, without the timbre, without the voice of mine that you know. So much for the fire. They had put everything on a picture, of the one, of the other, of the couple, and then they remained attached to the betting, and they are still speculating but they are no longer there. Each of them to the other, you were in league to destroy me, you conspired, you have covered all the trails, get out of it yourself and this short philosophical dialogue for your amusement. What is it? A destination. There where it arrives. So then everywhere that it arrives there was destination. Yes, but not before. No, that's convenient, since if it arrives there, it is that it was destined to arrive there. But then one can only say so after the fact. When it has arrived, it is indeed the proof that it had to arrive, and arrive there, at its destination, but before arriving, it is not destined. For example, it neither desires nor demands any address. There is everything that arrives where it had to arrive, but no destination before the arrival. Yes, but I meant to say something else of course. That's what I was saying. There you are. As I gave her to understand, I don't know if she was right to write what she wrote, and this is quite secondary, but in any event she was right to write it. Right a priori. I know nothing about how it happens, how it arrives for her, and it won't be soon either, it's only just beginning, but she cannot have been wrong to send herself that. 244-45. This envoy relayed 2 other postscripts, one within the other, which you will pardon me for reading as well, but you may presume that they are not by me. They situated, I believe, one of the essential places in the ongoing and interminable discussion with Lacan, namely, the thinking of contingency, singularity, the event, the encounter, chance, and tuck, which is also a certain thinking, interpretation, or experience of death whose signifier would be the phallus, all of which could summarize the unanswered questions I am still today putting to Lacan, with whom it is worth discussing, questions on the subject of what he has to say on, in effect, being, man, animals, especially animals, and thus got no less. P.S. I forgot, you are completely right. One of the paradoxes of destination is that if you wanted to demonstrate, for someone, that something never arrives at its destination, it's all over. The demonstration, once it had reached its end, would have proved what it was not supposed to demonstrate. But this is why, dear friend, I always say a letter can always not arrive at its destination, etc. This is a chance. You know that I never say that I'm right and never demonstrate anything. They put up with this very badly, consequently they would like nothing to have happened, everything wiped off the map. Wait for me. *P.S. Finally a chance, if you will, if you yourself can, and if you have it, the chance, tuck, fortune, this is what I mean, good fortune, good fate, us. The mischance, the misaddress, of this chance is that in order to be able not to arrive, it must bear within itself a force and a structure, a strain of the destination, such that it must also not arrive in any way. Even in arriving, always to some subject, the letter takes itself away from the arrival. At arrival it arrives elsewhere, always several times. You can no longer take hold of it. It is the structure of the letter, as postcard, in other words, the fatal partition that it must support, which demands this. I have said it elsewhere, delivered to a faculty subject to the same law. The letter demands this, right here, and you too, you demand it. 123-24. This thinking of the destination is indissociable, of course, from a thinking of death, from destination as death, and that is why I allowed myself to recall this barely private thing, between Lacan and me, the fact that, at each of our encounters, it was a question of death and that it was Lacan alone who spoke of it. What binds destination to death is said by the signatory of Envoys, for example, murder is everywhere, my unique and immense one. We are the worst criminals in history. And right here I kill you, save you run away, the unique, the living one over there whom I love. Understand me, when I write, right here, on these innumerable postcards, I annihilate not only what I am saying but also the unique addressee that I constitute, and therefore every possible addressee, and every destination. I kill you, I annul you at my fingertips, wrapped around my finger. To do so it suffices only that I be legible and I become illegible to you, you are dead. If I say that I write for dead addressees, not dead in the future but already dead at the moment when I get to the end of a sentence, it is not in order to play. Genet said that his theatre was addressed to the dead and I take it like that on the train in which I am going writing you without end. The addressees are dead, the destination is death, no, not in the sense of S or PS predication, according to which we would be destined to die, no, not in the sense in which to arrive at our destination, for us mortals, is to end by dying. 33. Well, pardon me for these readings, which lead me to hasten my conclusion with 3 remarks that I will make as brief and elliptical as possible. Our death. 2. The analytic situation. 3 times there is a psychoanalysis, in general or some properly nameable psychoanalysis, nameable by a proper name. Are on death, since all the texts I have just mentioned, I feel increasingly tempted not to accept the discourse on being for the earth, in either its Heideggerian form or the Lacanian form in which it is linked to the phallocentered signifier, without a lot of questions in return, questions of all sorts, and without a lot of displacements that are also experiences and not only speculative discourses, discussions, or even critical objections. But I can't say more about this here, these things are happening elsewhere, in recent seminars, in relation to the questions of the animal and of God. The remarkable things Lacan says on the animal are also in my view most problematic. In short, it would be a matter of contesting that death happens to some mortal being for death, rather, and this is a scandal for sense and for good sense, it happens only to some immortal who lacks for lacking nothing. I am thinking here of a certain passage in Zarathustra on the suffering that arises from a lack of lack and that, in the course of my seminar this year on eating the other I interpreted in a direction that perhaps intersects with what Nancy was saying the other evening. In La Facti de la Verite at the conclusion of an analysis of the lack that is never lacking, in its place, I pointed out the following, which at the time seemed to me to situate very well the difference with Lacan. The difference which interests me here is that a formula to be understood as one will the lack does not have its place in dissemination. 441. 2. On the analytic situation, another recollection from my meeting with Lacan. In this case, I was not a direct witness and the question of the archive is thus posed in yet a different manner. René Girard reported to me that after my lecture in Baltimore, when he was seeking to elicit from Lacan his own generous assessment, Lacan supposedly replied, yes, it's good, but the difference between him and me is that he does not deal with people who are suffering, meaning by that, people in analysis. What did he know about that? Very careless. To be able to say such a thing, so imperturbably, and know such a thing, he could not have been referring either to suffering, alas, I too deal with people who suffer all of you, for example, or to transference, that is, to love, which has never needed the analytic situation to claim its victims. Lacan thus made clinical treatment, institutionalized in a certain mode, and the rules governing the analytic situation into criteria of absolute competence for speaking about all this. Here is a better-known episode that occurred some 10 years later after Lacan had used the future anterior several times to reappropriate by way of antediting, when he said, for example, that he was giving up certain concepts and words 27 for instance, gram and other similar things, of which as far as I know he never made any use and which, instead of giving up, he should have simply taken up. In a session of the seminar in 1977, still Ellen Sue Q-site, Lacan made a compulsive blunder. He said that he thought I was in analysis, laughter from the audience, the sentence replaced by an ellipsis in Ornica, but too late because the transcription had circulated. Once again the problem of the archive that no one can master, here no more than ever because of this recording technique. The thing has now been recounted and commented on in the postcard, 202-4. Elizabeth Raldinesco cites it but only in the official version from Ornica, with its ellipsis. Meanwhile, since the legal archive covers less and less of the whole archive, this archive remains unmasterable and continues on its way, in continuity with the anarchive. In any case, what did he know about it, whether or not I was in analysis, and what could that mean? The fact that I have never been in analysis, in the institutional sense of the analytic situation, does not mean that I am not, here or there, in a way that cannot be easily toted up, analyze and analyst in my own time and in my own way. Like everyone else. In a remark that has been archived by the recording machines but forever withdrawn from the official archive, Lacan says this, notice and admire the syntax and the reference to non-knowledge and truth, someone about whom I did not know that to tell the truth I believe he is in analysis, about whom I did not know that he was in analysis, but this is merely a hypothesis. His name is Jacques Derrida, who has written a preface to this Verbia. 28. This non-knowledge in truth of a belief, to tell the truth I believe he is in analysis, of a simple hypothesis, concerned therefore the being in analysis of someone whom he, Lacan, was not afraid to name, the being in analysis with a couple of analysts, for he couples them, added Lacan, who was then obviously unaware of the fact that one of the two, who was my friend, was dead by the time I wrote the preface in question, which was thus written to his memory, as homage, and in his absence. How could Lacan make his listeners laugh on the subject or on the basis of a blunder, his own, concerning a hypothetical analyse, and even as he himself presented himself, and this is, moreover, one of his most interesting assertions, as an analyse and, a master of truth as analyse and not as analyst. How could he insist on 2 occasions on my real status as institutional known analyst and on what he wrongly supposed to be my status as institutional analyse and, whereas he ought to have been the first to cast suspicion on the limits or borders of these sites, to pay attention to the tangled knots of this invertination. 3 times this leads to my last point. However insufficient, intermittent, distracted, or floating my interminable listening to Lacan may be, what keeps it on alert is less the question of philosophy, science, or psychoanalysis than another question, which concerns a certain dominant state, meaning the dominance of the master, of the history of philosophy, science, psychoanalysis, namely, the dominant state that at a certain point I called phallogocentrism, according to a certain historical, precarious, conventional, and finite determination of the analytic situation, of its rules and its limits. To this analytic situation, it seems to me, one might aptly apply the topological expression that I ventured in another circumstance, the geosmatic invertination of the borders. I proposed the expression in pars imperiex, which I thank Stephen Melville for having mentioned here. If this is indeed how things are, the question of knowing whether or not there is some psychoanalysis exian, his, yours, mine that can hold up or that is coming, this incalculable, unimaginable, unaccountable, unattributable question is displaced to the degree that the analytic situation, and thus the analytic institution, is deconstructed, as if by itself, without deconstruction or deconstructive project. As for the relations between this deconstruction as experience of the impossible and the there is, I have spoken of them elsewhere, it is archived. What will I not have said today? But if I had said that we loved each other very much, Lacan and I, and thus we promised each other very much, and that this was for me a good thing in this life, would I have been in the truth? Stephen Melville said that the promise always risked being also a threat. That's true. But I would always prefer the promise.